So, understanding our multi-generational village. I wanted to start today with some wise words from the faith keeper Oren Lyons of the Council of Chiefs on the Onondaga Nation. The peacemaker taught us about the 7 generations. He said, when you sit in council for the welfare of the people, you must not think of yourself or your family, not even your generation. He said, make your decisions on behalf of the 7 generations coming so that they may enjoy what you have today. And it is in this multi-generational spirit that I bring you this message today. Now, I've got a lot of people to thank before I get going here. The first is that the message is based on the research of this book. It's by Jean Twenge, and it's called Generations, The Real Difference Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers in Silence, and What They Mean for America's Future. I want to make sure I don't knock something over down there. And in addition to that, I have to give a huge thank you to the Reverend Matthew Johnson, who serves the Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Rockford, Illinois, for suggesting the book. I was at a ministers' conference down in Milwaukee last summer, I think it was, and he was suggesting this book because if you recall last fall, you had a unit on heritage, and he thought it was a really good thing to talk about the generational differences in his congregation. I was so excited about the book when the conference was over. Before my drive back to Appleton, I downloaded it on my phone and started listening to it and really, really got hooked. It's a book where it's intense research on this topic, but she presents it in a way that's very casual and easy to understand. So I really enjoyed it and would recommend it to anybody. So let me do a summary of it first. You have to understand that the trends that she points out are averages. So kind of like what Hannah said, if you don't quite agree with what the dates are that she used, that's okay. If you hear me talk about a generation and you think you're part of that generation, but what I'm talking about doesn't seem to make any sense to you, that's okay too. Maybe you don't fit the average. And then the edges of all of these are fluid. So, for example, Joel and I are right at the end of the baby boom into the Gen X, and then there's Zillennials and all kinds of things out there. That's okay too. And then finally, I know this is going to be a surprise to a lot of you, Unitarian Universalists are not average. Every one of them. The example would be my own generation. The average boomer, as we probably all know from the popular press, has become very conservative year by year as they've aged. But not us. UUs remain those liberal, progressive, hopeful hippies that are gathering every Sunday. So just keep all of that in mind. So Twenge's findings. Basically, she says that the previous books published about generations kind of cited that it was sort of this human phenomenon done in waves, that you'd have this generation, like the greatest generation, that would step up and really make things happen, and then you have the counter, all like a pendulum swinging. And then the next generation would kind of step back and be kind of quiet. That's why they were called the silent generation. And then the baby boomers would come up. So I guess from that perspective, it made sense. But she said that doesn't make sense then. And so she looked into it more specifically and said, frankly, it's technology and always has been technology that crosses where the generations change. And that's because it has to be a technology that's so pervasive that it shifted just the mindset or the way people show up in the world. And some of them, when I'm saying technology, it wasn't like Joel was talking about with computers. It can be simple stuff. Let me give you the list that she generated. And also, I'll give you dates. Now, keep in mind, that isn't the only time we had this technology. This is the time it was invented and became popular and when it had its biggest impact. So the first one, radio. Radio was 1894 to the 1940s. Think about how impactful that was, that instead of having to find out what's going on in the world from print, you gathered in your living room every night and heard it on the radio. Then that was followed, of course, by television, 1947 to 1990. After that, well, kind of mixed in with that is home appliances. 1947 to 1985. So she's talking about things like dishwashers, washing machines, refrigerators, things that just made home life not quite so difficult, and you had a little bit more free time. Now, if you lived in the South, the next one, air conditioning, was a big deal. And that was the 1950s to 1980s that came on strong. And if you're a baby boomer of a certain age, birth control, 1960 to 1969, made a huge difference. And then, Joel, computers, 1964 to 2005 are the dates she used. And then internet news. Remember, some of you that are older, back in the day when there were only 3 stations and news only came on at certain times of day? Then internet news hit in 2000 to 2010, followed, of course, by social media, which is 2006 to 2015. So that's how she chose her dates and had all kinds of research as to, here, look, there's the impact. You can see it in the charts. So after looking at all of this data and establishing it in these ranges, she came up with 2 trends in America. This is America, United States of America specifically. And she said the 2 trends, the first one is the independence trend. The upside is that there was ever increasing personal freedom and how each generation, since the greatest generation, has defined themselves. The downside to that, she says, is there's ever increasing isolation and loneliness, along with the associated mental health issues that brings on. The second trend, she called it slowing life trend, and I thought it was kicking back on a beach somewhere with a drink in my hand, but she meant it's not a laid-back attitude, it's delaying those growing up milestones, she called it, specifically marriage and children, that they've gotten later and later and later as every generation comes along. And she says that the upside is that child raising is given far more attention and resources than it was in the past. But the downside is there's a dramatically declining birth rate. And what does that mean for the economy and supporting the older generations? So those are the overall general themes. I'm going to go through generation by generation, kind of do a description that she used, and kind of give you the highlights of what was their greatest moments and what were their greatest challenges. So first of all, and by the way, there are 7 generations. And the reason she picked these, she didn't talk much about greatest generation because she wanted to talk about the generations that still have a sizable percentage of the population. But there are 7 generations, from the greatest generation to the alphas. So the greatest generation. So, as Hannah said, some of you probably personally know members of this generation, but as far as I knew, there's nobody that the youngest would be 100 years old, and nobody that age in my 3 congregations, and I didn't think there was here, but maybe there is, and somebody's looking on Zoom. They have this name, of course, because our country faced unprecedented challenges during the first half of the 20th century, and they rose to the occasion and brought us through it. It was all about the country, the community, coming together to save democracy and the American way of life. Profound change occurred with this generation, and we enjoy the benefits of what that generation brought and still suffer some of the consequences today. The most poignant is the greatest generation redrew the world map after World War II, which gave us Palestine and Israel. But overall, it was a time of coming together for the greater good. Okay, moving on. Silence. Silence, silence. Conformity was the name of the game, according to Trengi. Very little personal freedom. Actually, they even had a little less independence than the generation before them, because during World War II, a lot of women went into the workforce and were employed, and then left that when the men came home after the war, and you had to start the baby boom. So they moved to the suburbs. There was a lot of community taking care of each other, really tight neighborhoods with tons and tons of kids. If you weren't around, somebody would be watching your kids somewhere. The silence grew up with radio. They were the folks that were every evening listened to the news or listened to the president speak on the radio. They grew up with the destruction of the Great Depression and World War II, and it came and became very real to them in their living rooms. And out of all of this devastation, they built a new world and the institutions. They made sacrifices for the common good. They married early, had lots of kids. According to Twenge, they had the highest birth rate in the world at the time. Then you've got to remember, baby boomers, we think of the civil rights movement and a lot of those kind of movements, and I always thought of them as baby boomer things. They're actually started by the silent generation. Martin Luther King Jr. was a silent. So they started the civil rights movement, and then it was carried on later by baby boomers. They were patriots, they were steady, they were community-oriented. But then, as the Reverend Johnson in Rockford said, conformity didn't always work for everyone, never does. If you didn't fit into the compulsory religious world of the 1950s, you came to the one place where you could be different, the Unitarian Church. So that's the silence. Baby boomers, the largest generation ever, as you could see even in this room. Pushed out the small generations around them, the silents and the Gen Xers. Boomers, and this is no news to anybody, have dominated our culture, economy, and politics for decades, not just because of our numbers, but because of science. We're living longer, we can work longer, we just won't give up, right? Look at me. Eternal optimists, we believe in possibility. We're hopeful that we can build a better world. We carried out the civil rights movement from the silence, and their influence, because of being so big, just made a lot of change happen. They married early, like the silence, but because of the access to the birth control pill, delayed children and had even less children. Baby boomers are known for freedom and rock and roll, hence the Who. Free love, free drugs, free speech. Sometimes it was a good revolution, sometimes a really bad curse or nightmare. They were much more individualistic and very, very interested in personal journeys, a journey of discovery and becoming. They always wanted to know what was new, always pushing the boundaries. This is when the LSD popularity happened, psychedelic drug trips, New Age religion became popular, especially in the West Coast. And think of all the unusual things that were happening at the time creatively in art, music, theater, culture. This is when baby boomers would pick up and go to Europe, Asia, you name it, for some travel and discovering yourself. All kinds of unusual hobbies started coming to the forefront, and there was always a cause to be a part of. Publicly, the boomers were asking these really big questions. Who are we? Where are we going, and what is life for? Twenge sums it up with, baby boomers have always believed that the world could be better, and they're still trying to make that real, whether you're liberal or conservative. Gen Xers. Gen Xers were mostly left to fend for themselves, especially the early ones, because two working parents weren't at home after school, and they didn't have the structured after-school programs like we have today. They had to take care of themselves, for better or for worse. In fact, they're often called latchkey kids because they either wore it around their neck or had a little thing on their wrist with their keys so they could get themselves into the house. This generation delayed both children and marriage, and they often came in that order. It wasn't really that important to get married at all for the first time. Their insistence on genuineness and authenticity means that institutions and their promises are viewed with a lot of skepticism. Sure, whatever was the key expression of the time. But with all their independence and showing of bravado, there's a deep longing for community and connection. Mental health measurements when they were children were horrible. But as adults, somehow they found their way and come out okay. Many turn to the free market and materialism, think tech millionaires. And liberals kind of rose above all this cynicism and just kind of went out there and did what had to be done. In fact, that's another key phrase with Gen Xers. Get stuff done, although they don't usually use the word stuff. Millennials. This is the generation for which much was promised and not delivered. This is the every child gets a trophy generation. It was emphasizing the belief that each person is sacred, special, and unique, and that should be celebrated all the time. But it built up some pretty high expectations. It was expected that if you work hard, if you graduate from college, the American dream of a happy life will be yours. It was the highest educated generation with unbelievable debt. It was a rough start for the older millennials. 9/11 happened, the Iraq War, and the Great Recession. They feel like they got a raw deal, even though the data shows that they're doing as well as the previous generations. Reverend Johnson had a very poignant statement. He said, "You were promised gardens and inherited ashes. They long for the world they were promised, but they do take care of themselves and each other. They have a strong belief in individualism. Each person should be free to live their own life, making their own choices. They got married even later and had even less kids later. The fewer children are very protected and nourished in a way that they all kind of longed for when they were growing up, or maybe they did get it. Millennials are very vocal. Their dissatisfaction with the world encourages a strong and loud refusal to tolerate harassment, oppression, and neglect." Okay, Gen Zers. I always think of Gen Zers as these little kids. I've forgotten how old I've gotten. Many are in their 20s now. Don't laugh. The Gen Zers, independence, I work with a lot of youth groups that have Gen Zers in them, and independence trend takes this huge leap and is changing the world forever. They believe each person should be free to be themselves in ways never even considered by previous generations. Think of the terms neurodiversity, gender expression, sexual identity, even fashion. Everyone is their own brand. Kind of thrifting is back in and is popular, and so just find your own way. They don't just follow what they're supposed to be doing. They are their own creator. They're free to claim themselves and name themselves with their own unique identity. I find it very refreshing. They are also taking their time to grow up. This is a weird one for those of you that come from my generation. They are not even interested in getting their driver's license on their 16th birthday. What is up with that? That is a sacred rite of passage. And if the current trends continue, they will be married later in life and have even less kids than the millennials. Frankly, they believe the rest of us have just totally screwed them over. And think about it, climate change, school shootings, and the polarization gives them some pretty good reasons to think that. However, they intend to do something about it. They vote in higher numbers than any generation since the silence. They speak up, do not have the patience for how things are. Tragically, they are also the most lonely generation on record. Through their phones, they're both deeply connected around the world and deeply isolated all at the same time. Their mental health, especially the younger Gen Zs who went through COVID in their critical socialization years, is a disaster. However, they are more likely to name their mental health needs than any generation has ever been. Finally, alphas, the younger kids. Little can be said yet. The oldest ones are just turning 11. They never knew a world without COVID or global warming. And Twenge prefers the name polars rather than alphas because of the melting polar ice caps and the extreme polarization in our world now. Technology is a given. They have tablets in their hands by the time they're 2. And demographically, they will be the smallest and most diverse generation we've ever had. All right. So that's kind of summarizing the book. I wrote this sermon a couple months ago when pluralism was the theme, the gift of pluralism. And I had to kind of set back and say, so what does this mean for us? Our fellowships, the 3 I serve, and this one, of course, are several of the few multi-generational groups left in our communities, as other religious institutions which are still flourishing. We value the kind of pluralism in which each person in every generation is a sacred being. And Twenge's research has clearly demonstrated that every American generation is very diverse in culture and experience. By the way, those are part of the definition of pluralism that we've adopted in our values with the UUA. But what about the future? Twenge goes on to talk about this key trends which frankly are leading to more decline. The slowing life downtrend, really radically declining birth rates. We are now below the level where we will repopulate the population. It's below 2, which she pointed out in the book. Japan went through this in the 1980s, and their economy has been shrinking ever since. And then financially, it's talking about the shrinking safety net for aging boomers and Gen Xers. But more so, she talks about in Japan the profound sense of loneliness with the older generations because there are no younger people there, big families, to be around. They have to work harder at it. Independence and freedom. She says it's leading to more loneliness and declining mental health. It's leading to more political polarization and declining trust in our government and institutions. And then she goes on to say a continued dramatic decline in religion, both public, meaning a religious organization, and private, people doing private religious practices. So she does half a page in the book on the role of religion in the future, and I'm going to read it to you because she says it very well. Humans have an innate desire to believe in something larger than themselves and to seek meaning in their lives. If religion stops filling this role, something else will step in to fill it. In the U.S., the individualistic ethos of equality and self-determination has filled this role to an extent. For many modern citizens, their belief in equality across race, gender, sexual orientation, and transgender status is just as deeply held as religious beliefs. In general, she says, groups based on political beliefs may be taking the place of religious groups. Political views become sorted into moral tribes, with each side disliking or even hating the other. For many, the world is being sorted into us and them, believers and heretics. And she ends with this statement, which chokes me up every time I read it. World history suggests that transferring religious beliefs into politics will not end well. So to me, my friends, that is our wake-up call. We, Unitarian Universalists, are uniquely positioned as a religious community. Think about it. We believe in individuality and independence, but practice it in a pluralistic community. We believe that supporting political change in accordance with our values is a religious, even spiritual endeavor. I believe that Unitarian Universalism and our fellowships should continue, not because we're institutions started by boomers who want to leave a legacy, but because there exists a profound and critical need for what we have to offer for Gen Xers, Millennials, Gen Zers, and Alphas. This fellowship, for example, has undergone very significant change in the last 10 years. I was here back when the previous planning was pretty much done by silence and boomers, maybe a few older Gen Xers, I'm not sure about that. Same as in my fellowships that I serve. But we're at a major and critical turning point culturally now. Religious institutions, as our generations have known them, are failing across the board. And we'll follow them into failure if we act and think like we always have, and continue on with what makes us feel comfortable, us meaning boomers, perhaps even dreaming to go back to the days of yore, right? Millennials and Gen Zers are very different. Their need for our message and community is greater than any generation, yet they reject it because we're lumped in with all the other failing religious institutions. Our mission is to support the development of our members, and by extension, support the efforts to build a more loving and just community in the communities where we exist. So how do we do that? I mean, it's obvious. Clearly not with more of the same. Multi-generational pluralism means that everyone has a role. And in this case, as we move forward and already are thinking about it, we need to center millennials and Gen Zers. What do they need? How can we help? How can we change to do it better for them? And the baby boomers and maybe older Gen Xers, we need to step back, listen to what they have to say, where they want to take us. Now, maybe we'll be the executors because we know how to get stuff done, but let's not have it be our vision any longer. You are already known here as a group of passionate people who are not afraid of change or innovation. You wouldn't be where you were at if it had been something you were stuck in the past. Before this sermon today, I asked Hannah to give me a couple of examples of things that are happening here, and she gave me some really obvious ones. She said the most obvious is your governing board. It's composed of half Gen Xers and millennials. Of course, the other half is boomers. And that both Reverend Christina and Reverend Hannah are millennials, right? So the congregation has leaders that reflect the diversity of the generations already. That's a very good start. And then the informal 9 o'clock coffee house, which I really still want to try out, but I don't get many Sundays off. That service that was built in is something that began to appeal to the younger people, but it kind of has taken off and it includes everybody from all different ages. It's a good example of how considering different generations' needs can make stronger programming and community for everyone. So those are just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Keep it up. We need to continue to recreate ourselves and let other Unitarian Universalists and our communities see that it can be done. We can be relevant for the future. We can make a difference for the future. We can be what they need us to be. And that is how multi-generational pluralism works. And that's our 7 generations theology. Amen.